All right, so we are in our series on the world of the Bible, part 12. And again, I have no idea how long it'll go. It's the Bible. It could go, the next 7 years, but we'll see what happens. And I want to talk tonight about an issue that was very, very prevalent in that time and really up until recent times throughout the world. And that's the issue of idolatry, idol worship. And I thought the perfect place to begin would be the Ten Commandments. And so we'll be in Exodus 20, and I'd like to read verses 4 through 6. This is the second commandment. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. So when you read through the Ten Commandments, and I actually did this. I called it up, and because they're out there on the internet, I ran them through a word counter app, which is pretty cool. And I found out this is the second longest of all the commandments. The one that's longer is the fourth commandment about remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. But this is the second longest. And generally when you got a list of things, the longer something is, it tells you the more God places emphasis on it. And so that's what's happening here. God apparently puts a lot of emphasis. All the commandments are important, but some are longer. And this is one of them, this commandment about forbidding idolatry. So I want to work through it. Because like everything, especially the further back you get in the Old Testament, if you're going to understand it fully, it helps to have the context in mind. So you notice there in verse 4, it talks about a carved image or any likeness. And those words go together. And I looked them up. The two words carved image come from one Hebrew word, pesel, which essentially referred to a statue. And you could carve it out of stone or wood or sometimes metal. But anything that you would fashion in the form of a statue. And then the word likeness is the Hebrew word temuna. And that described anything that was made to look like something else. So in the context here of the second commandment, Israel is forbidden from carving anything that resembles any kind of animal, whether it's on earth, in the sky, or in the water. And that's again in verse 4. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, birds, on the earth beneath, animals, or in the water under the earth. So any kind of sea creatures or fish, whatever, that would live in the water. And the reason God was so specific here in telling Israel what they're not to do, you have to remember, Israel is getting ready to go into the land of Canaan. That's the promised land. And archaeologists have gone back and they've studied the societies of that time in history in Canaan. And the vast majority of them, when they made idols to represent the gods they worshiped, those idols almost always appeared in the form of some kind of an animal or a bird or a fish. And so that's why this commandment is really, really specific here. God is saying when it comes to worship, I don't want you copying what the Canaanites do and creating images or statues that resemble any kind of animal life. And then when you move forward, God added more general prohibitions against idols, and he added the idea that they weren't just forbidden from carving images of animals, but they were not to use any means to make any kind of idols. And a couple of those laws are found in the book of Leviticus, and I put them in your outline. Leviticus 19:4, do not turn to idols or make for yourselves any gods of cast metal. So the Ten Commandments only talked about carving. This is casting or using, metallurgy or melting metal into a certain kind of form. And then Leviticus 26:1, you shall not make idols for yourselves or erect an image or pillar nor shall you set up a figured stone in your land to bow down to it, for I am the Lord your God. So again, adding to what was laid out in the Ten Commandments. And notice that both times the explanation is, I am the Lord your God. So it's clear what the problem was. These idols represented false gods. Now, had you been alive in that time of history, and had you been one of the Canaanite people living around, and you would have heard that Israel's God had handed down this kind of law, you would have been shocked. Because, again, archaeologists have studied that time of history in that part of the world. And as far as they can tell, as far as historians can tell, every group of people in Canaan, and really throughout almost all the known world in that day, they all practiced idolatry. It wasn't an outlier or an aberration. This was universal. This is how people worshiped. And ancient people in that time really couldn't have imagined worship without having some kind of visible, tangible, physical object to help them in that worship. And so in the context of what God is telling Israel here, here's what you have to understand. God wasn't telling Israel, well, you can't make images of other gods, you can just make images of me. That's not in there. He's strictly prohibiting them from using any material objects, even to represent him. So it wasn't okay to have an idol of Yahweh. God is saying no idols at all. Now, why would that be? Well, one of the reasons is to emphasize the fact that he was transcendent. He was over creation. Israel was not allowed to have a say in how they worship God, because that would mean they were in control. And you notice that when you read the Old Testament, particularly the Law of Moses, God lays it out in detail. I mean, everything that they have to do is very, very specific. And so Israel can't come up with their own plan and this is how we want to worship. It's just not part of what God says. And so God's not giving them any say. And that ties into something else that set Israel apart or made them different from the nations around them. The nations living around Israel, they had created their gods in their own minds based on what made sense to them. In other words, they looked at the world around them and they came up with stories to explain what they saw. So where did the ocean come from? Well, they had a story that explained that. Where did the sky come from? Where do storms come from? How do crops grow? How do animals, all these things. And so they had these stories that their ancestors had developed years and years and years and years ago, and they had passed those stories down from generation to generation. And what they had done then, as those stories had gone down, they had come up with idols to represent the gods as they understood them. Each god had its own role to play in creation or in the way the world worked. There were gods of fertility. There were gods for crops. There were gods that specialized in blessing you with children. There were all kinds. There were gods for warfare against your enemies. And so every god had their own, I'll call it a specialty, right? A particular benefit that you could get from that god if you worship them in the right way. And those idols, those images, express that in different ways. And it really just kind of shows you why idolatry was kind of foolish, because people designed these idols. People had created these gods in their mind, and they bowed down to the idols as though the idols had some kind of control over them. But an idol, think about it, by its very nature, is under the control of the people that made it. If I have a statue that I worship and yet I can pick it up and move it around or change it or paint it or break it or whatever, right? I'm the one in control. And so it's interesting that first of all, of course, God condemns idol worship, but he also makes fun of people that practice it. There's a lot of verses in the Old Testament. I picked out a great one in Jeremiah chapter 10, verse 5. Fantastic. Their idols are like scarecrows in a cucumber field, and they cannot speak. They have to be carried, for they cannot walk. Do not be afraid of them, for they cannot do evil, neither is it in them to do good. And again, that's just one verse. They are throughout the Old Testament, God really mocking people who worship idols, saying, here you create this thing and you bow down to it and worship it as though it has some power, and it doesn't. It's just an empty object. So if that's the reality, if idols have no power, and they don't, then why have people throughout history, until recently, created idols to represent the gods they worshipped. And essentially, it had to do with the fact that the world has always been a dangerous place. Things go wrong, even today, right? But people in that day didn't understand why things went wrong. I'm not saying we have much more insight than they did, but we think we do, right? But in their minds, put yourself in the situation of somebody 3,000-4,000 years ago, dealing with floods, famines, sickness, war, whatever. In their minds, the reason life was so chaotic was because there were these gods up there in the universe looking down on you, and you had done something to anger them. And so they created idols, statues representing those gods, as a reminder of the importance of keeping the gods happy. They knew that the statue wasn't the god, but in their minds it represented the gods. And so if you actually had been alive back then, and you would have gone into any kind of small town or any large city in let's say in the ancient Near East, what you would have seen is that any higher area of the city, if there was a hillside or someplace that had been built up, there would be a shrine there. And by shrine, I mean a place of worship with altars built to the different gods of that community or that city. And they are always put in a prominent place where everybody could see them and would see them. Why? Because when you stepped out of your house in the morning, the idea was your eyes would be drawn to the highest place in the community. You would see those shrines, and it would remind you, number one, you need to offer your prayers to the gods. Number two, you need to make your sacrifices to the gods. Why? So you could seek their favor. Have you ever been reading in the Old Testament and you come across a reference to the high places? That's what that's referring to. Every community in the ancient world, almost always, had a high place. And people built their shrines there to the gods on top of hills where they could be seen by everyone. Because again, people said we need to be reminded of the importance of seeking the blessing of the gods, seeking the favor of the gods. And again, they had a very specific reason for doing it, because life was hard. Disaster was just around the corner. Drought would come and your crops would fail. And you know what? There was no crop insurance. There was just no food, right? Here, if the crops fail in Texas, it'd be bad, but Kansas will have wheat. Iowa will have corn, right? It's going to be hard, but we can bring in food. But in that time of history, that didn't exist. Drought came, crops failed, people starved. Diseases would come through. They didn't have doctors like we do. They didn't have medications like we do. And people got sick and died. And they didn't understand why. They didn't understand how sicknesses work, how microbes and germs and viruses do their damage. They didn't understand the weather cycle, that sometimes droughts come because of some weather condition or some particular weather formation happening. And so what they did, they interpreted everything like that in spiritual terms. We did something to make the gods angry. And that's why everything is going wrong. That's why we're in this drought, because the gods are angry at us. They're judging us. That's why our kids are dying of whatever this disease is, because the gods are angry at us. So that's why they had to have idols everywhere. And I get it. It was wrong, but I understand it. They needed constant reminders, they thought, of the importance of seeking the favor of the gods. They needed to be reminded of how important it was to ask the gods every day for protection, because maybe if they got it right, then this year might be better. Maybe this year the crops would grow and flourish. Maybe this year the children would be healthy. That's how they lived. They were afraid of the gods. You didn't make sacrifices to gods back then because you loved them. You made them because you wanted the gods to leave you alone. Here was the problem. They never knew when they had done enough. And so some years they would have done everything they could to demonstrate their faithfulness to the gods. They would have given every sacrifice they could imagine. They would have prayed all the prayers they could think of to pray, and sometimes things still went very wrong. Sometimes famine came and the crops died in the field. sometimes disease came and the children died anyway, even though they had done all they knew to do. And so at the end of the day, and you go back and read the stories of religions in the ancient world and their spiritual writings, a lot of times they would simply say, the gods are unpredictable. The gods can't always be trusted because, again, no matter what you did, you could never be sure you had done enough. And sometimes the gods would judge you just because they were angry about something and you just got hit. That's the biggest reason that God would never allow himself to be represented by an idol or a statue. God says to Israel, you're not only not going to make statues of the gods of the Canaanites, you're not going to make a statue of me. Why? Because the longer that statue sat there, the statue to Yahweh, the God of Israel, over the years people would assume, oh, we have an idol like they do. And they would begin to assume that their God, Yahweh, the God of Israel, was just like the gods of the nations around them. They've got idols, we've got our statue. And God wanted Israel to always remember and never forget that he was absolutely nothing like those false gods. He was reminding them here. He's saying, I'm not unpredictable like the so-called gods of the nations around you. I'm not dangerous like they are. Because what had God done for Israel? He had given them his law, right? Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And in the law, he clearly laid out everything he expected of them. And if they would follow what he said, it's found throughout the first 5 books of the Bible. If they would just follow what he had said, they would experience his blessings in ways they could never imagine. And that was the main reason idols were unacceptable. God is saying to Israel, I'm not like these gods. These aren't gods. I am the only God. And you will not worship me in the way they worship their gods, because I am not like those gods, and you are not like those people. That's what the second commandment is about. So let's read it one more time, then we'll have our discussion. Exodus 20, verses 4 through 6. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, on the earth beneath, that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. But now watch verse 6. Showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me. That's made Israel different from the nations around them. They were to love God, and who do what? Keep my commandments. I'm not like them, he's saying. Their gods are unpredictable. You never knew what they were going to do. But the God of Israel, you knew. If you were faithful to him, he would bless you. So that's why idolatry was forbidden. Not the only reason, but a huge part of it.